This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference on acid rock drainage and water quality, potential environmental health impacts in Alaska. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. TALASKA is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. TALASKA aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. And you can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. And we're joined today by Jill Yorty of the Northern Alaska Environmental Center and Dr. Kendra Zamzow of the Center for Science and Public Participation. Both of our speakers have PowerPoint slides that you will need to access in order to follow along. So earlier this morning, I sent a link to Dr. Zamzow's presentation to everyone who had signed up for the call. And there are two versions of that presentation. One enables you to see animations, and the other is a PDF. I understand that some people are having trouble accessing the animated one because of blocking in their agency or whatever. So if that's the case, then just go to the PDF, and Dr. Zamzow will do her best to make it clear to people who are seeing both versions. After that email that I sent early this morning, I sent another one with Jill Yorty's presentation as a PDF attachment. So hopefully folks are still at their computers and can access that as well. Jill will be speaking first, so you'll want to pull that one up first. So please take a moment to download these presentations so you can follow along. And both of our speakers will be indicating when they're changing slides to help you advance your files. Let's see here. I do have a little bit more. Well, just a reminder, it's an audio-only teleconference, not a webinar, but our speakers will remind you of where they are. The call will last 1 hour with time at the end for your questions. And one more housekeeping item before we begin. Just as a nonprofit working hard to keep our costs down so more money can go towards our programs, we have a request. If you happen to have free long distance on the phone you are calling from for these calls, please help us to save money by using the toll number, which is 213-289-0155 when calling in instead of the toll-free number beginning in 877. By saving ACAP money on teleconference fees, you'll ensure that more of our resources can go back into our Alaska calls so we can continue to bring you exceptional speakers on a range of topics and so we can make these calls accessible to Alaskans and others across the country. We also accept donations online at akaction.org. So again, I'd like to give folks an opportunity to hang up and call back in on the toll number. Again, this is only if you have free long distance or unlimited minutes. So just do this if that's the case. Otherwise, we're happy that you're using the toll-free number. We want these calls to be accessible. So that number, again, is 213-289-0155. And while folks are doing that, I will go ahead and give those instructions for accessing the presentations again in case anybody joined late. So again, you should have received 2 emails this morning, one with a link to Dr. Zamzow's presentation in both PDF and as an animated version that's online, and a second email with Jill Yorty's presentation as a PDF attachment. So I hope that everyone is able to access those easily. And now I'd like to welcome and introduce Jill Yorty. Jill is Clean Water and Mining Program Director at Northern Alaska Environmental Center, where she advocates for environmental conservation and sustainable resource management. Jill originally hails from the Front Range of Colorado, but has called Fairbanks her home since August of 2009. And since arriving in Fairbanks for master's level studies in archaeology and stable isotope research at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Jill has traveled all over interior and northern Alaska, worked for an environmental testing firm, and fallen in love with Alaska. Welcome, Jill. Would you like to go ahead and begin?
Hi, Diana. Thank you for that introduction. Yes. Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for calling in. Like Diana said, my name is Jill Yorty, and I'm the Clean Water and Mining Program Director at the Northern Alaska Environmental Center. We're located in Fairbanks, and we work to promote conservation and sustainable resource stewardship in interior and Arctic Alaska through education and advocacy. I moved to Alaska 5 years ago and have a background in anthropology and water chemistry. Before Dr. Kendra Zamzow digs into her presentation on acid rock drainage and environmental health impacts of ARD, I wanted to give you some background on a couple proposed hard rock mines in Alaska to give some context for where this issue may impact Alaskans. I'll talk about two proposals, both at very different stages of development. The first is the proposed Donlan.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just need to know, is anyone else having any difficult hearing Jill, or is it just my line? Kendra, is it fuzzy at all?
Yeah, this is Lance Powell. I've got Jill on speakerphone, but it's not very loud.
Speak up, Jill. All right, I'll speak up, and hopefully that'll fix the problem.
I'm so sorry. I just want to make sure that everyone gets to hear everything. So
yeah, that completely makes sense.
Okay, so
all right,
just back up a moment, and I am sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no problem. Okay, so I'm the Clean Water and Mining Program Director at the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, and we're located in Fairbanks and work to promote conservation and sustainable resource stewardship in interior and Arctic Alaska through education and advocacy. I moved to Alaska 5 years ago and have a background in anthropology and water chemistry. And before Dr. Zamdow digs into her presentation on acid rock drainage and the environmental health impacts of ARD, I wanted to give you some background on a few proposed hard rock mines in Alaska to give some context for where this issue may impact Alaskans. I'll talk about two proposals, both at very different stages of development. The first is the proposed Donlan gold mine, which is already in the permitting process required by the National Environmental Protection Act. The second is the proposed copper mine at the Arctic deposit, which has a preliminary economic assessment, but is still several years from starting permitting. And now I'll move on to slide number 2. The proposed Donlan gold mine is being developed by Donlan Gold, a company jointly owned by Barrick Gold and Nova Gold. The proposed open pit gold mine would be located about 10 miles north of the village of Crooked Creek along the Kuskokwim River. If permitted, the mine would take 3 to 4 years to construct and is expected to have an operational life of 27.5 years. Mining operations over the life of the mine would have a total footprint of over 7.5 square miles. This proposed mine has completed the scoping portion of permitting, and the draft environmental impact statement is expected to be released in late 2014. Following the release of the draft EIS, there will be a public review and comment period with community meetings. The final environmental impact statement is estimated to be completed by late 2015, with a record of decision following soon after, and any permits required being created then. Next slide. So the Donlan Creek Gold Mine would be an open pit bulk tonnage mine and would process approximately 3.85 billion tons of material over 27.5 years. Of this material, over 3 billion tons of it would be waste rock. And what Donlan Gold has done is a preliminary study to evaluate how much of that waste rock would be what they consider to be potentially acid generating, which has the potential for acid rock drainage, or non-acid generating. Of the estimated 3 billion tons of waste rock, 225 million tons of it is estimated to be potentially acid generating. And of this, there's 3 different categories that they have for potentially acid generating. The first is what they refer to as PAG5, which would have several decades to any onset of acid rock drainage. And this makes up about 2.86% of the total estimated waste rock. The next category is PAG6, which is expected to have acid rock drainage within the life of the mine if it occurs. And this makes up 4.43% of that waste rock. The final category of potentially acid generating rock is PAG7, and that would be kind of the fastest acting, most extreme, and would be anticipated to produce acid within a few years of being mined, and this makes up 0.08% of the total waste rock. And they have a couple different plans for how to deal with this. PAG5, the one that would take a long time to have acid rock drainage, would be blended with non-acid generating rock in their waste rock facility. PAG6 would be segregated within the waste rock facility and then capped so that to limit access of water to it, both during the life of the mine and after. And then any PAG6 that is mined once partial backfilling of the ACMA pit is possible would be backfilled into the mine pit itself. Non-acid generating rock, which is estimated to be the majority of the waste rock, would be stored in the waste rock facility, or some of it would be backfilled into the pit once mining is complete. The water usage of this mine is estimated to have a total usage rate of 17,838 gallons per minute during the mine life, during processing. Their goal is to have as little discharge of contact water as possible. And contact water is anything that's coming in contact with the mining operations. So pit wall runoff, any water that runs off of or comes in contact with the waste rock facility or the tailing storage facility. And so they would reuse a lot of this water in the mine processing itself. During wet years, or what they classify as wet years, where there's higher than average precipitation, they may need to discharge some wastewater. So they have a water treatment plant and would treat that water before discharging it into Copper Creek. Then there would be discharge of wastewater seasonally after the pit lake fills post-closure. And after the closure of the mine, they plan to divert all water runoff from the entire facility into the pit, and they anticipate it would take several decades to completely fill that pit before it would need to have any discharge. Next slide. This is a really cool tool from the USGS called the National Map Streamer. And what you can do is go to this website and pick any point along a waterway, and you can trace both downstream and upstream. And what I've done here is done a quick downstream trace from Crooked Creek, approximately where the mine would be located, to give you an example of all of the water that is downstream of the mine that could be potentially impacted by any acid rock drainage. So you can see that it goes from Crooked Creek into the Kuskokwim and then out from there. Next slide. Now we're on slide number 5. This is a visual that Donlan Gold has provided in their background material for that NEPA process. And this gives you an idea of the mine layout. You can see number 1 there is the proposed pit, and it would actually be 2 pits that end up being combined, the ACMA pit and the Lewis pit. Combined, these two at the completion of mining would be 2.2 miles long and 1 mile wide, with a maximum depth of 1,850 feet. Then next to it, which is labeled number 3 on the map, is the waste rock facility. This is where some of that potentially acid generating rock would be stored, and where all of the non-acid generating rock would be stored. And this waste rock facility would ultimately cover about 2.5 miles by 1 mile and cover 2,350 acres. 2,300 acres. Then finally, we've got the tailing storage facility, which is labeled number 2 on the map. And that would be the 2.5 miles by 1 mile wide, and it would cover 2,350 acres. Next slide. For some size context, this is a photo of the Fort Knox mine near Fairbanks, which is a currently operating gold mine in Alaska. And the proposed Donlan gold mine would have a final pit 4 times larger than the one at Fort Knox. Next slide. Now we'll move on to talking about the Arctic deposit proposed copper mine. This one would be within the Ambler Mineral District and would be developed by a company called Nova Copper. They are a wholly owned subsidiary of Nova Gold. Right now they are in what's considered to be the pre-feasibility status. Last summer, they completed a preliminary economic assessment of the project, which gives some recommendations on mining type and design, but it doesn't give a whole lot of really concrete specifics because they still need to do a lot more analysis to get more fine-grained plans in place. And they're a few years away from being able to do that. So right now, what they're proposing is an open pit bulk tonnage mine that would process approximately 36 million tons of material over a 12-year mine life. Of this material mined, 299.4 million tons of it would be waste rock, with an estimated 164.8 million tons being potentially acid generating. This would also generate 25.7 million tons of tailings. That's the leftover once they're done processing the ore and extracting the minerals from that. At this point, the water usage rate is unknown because they have not done fine-grained enough studies to determine actual water requirements. Similarly, they don't have a very detailed plan yet for how to deal with contact water and any runoff or discharge that would be necessary. What we do know about this mine is that their tailings storage facility, they would most likely keep a lot of that potentially acid-generating waste rock in the tailings storage facility, and it would need to be permanently covered with water to mitigate any acid mine drainage. During the post-closure and reclamation, we don't have a complete plan at this point of what that would look like, but it is understood that the tailings facility would have to be a wet closure, and that's what I was talking about, where it would need to be permanently covered with water. And that would also require long-term water management or perpetual water treatment. In the preliminary economic assessment, some closure costs were estimated, but these estimates do not include those costs for perpetual water treatment. And closure costs were estimated to be $30 to $60 million. Next slide. Now we're on slide number 8. This is a visual provided in the preliminary economic assessment where they took many samples of the material at the Arctic deposit and classified it based on its chemical composition for neutralization potential or acid potential. And what you're seeing here is any samples that are below that dashed line are potentially acid generating. And you can see that all of the yellow squares or the material that would be ore pretty much all falls in that area. And then about half of the waste rock itself would fall in that area. Then any samples that fall between the dashed line and the solid line, that's where they're not really certain and they would need to do more fine-grained tests to determine whether or not it's potentially acid generating or non-acid generating. Anything above the solid line is considered non-acid generating.
Jill, this is Diana again. Can you speak up just a little bit more?
I will try.
Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead and go to the next slide, slide number 9. This is a map provided by Nova Copper of the potential layout for their mine design. You can see that there's a tailing storage facility. The Arctic shell extents would be the final footprint of an open pit mine. And then the NAG stockpile, as it's labeled, is their waste rock storage facility with mining, processing, and administrative buildings up above that to the north. Now, some of the waterways that are potentially impacted by this proposed mine would be Subarctic Creek, which drains into the Shugnak River, which drains into the Kobuk River. That tailings dam at the end of mine life would be over 300 feet high, according to estimates within the preliminary economic assessment. And again, the potentially acid-generating tailings would be kept perpetually underwater behind that tailings dam. Next slide. Now we're on slide 10, and here I used the USGS National Map Streamer again to give you a visual of the downstream waters from this proposed mine. And you can see that it would come all the way through the Kobuk River out to the coast. And of course, if anybody has any questions for the sources, I got all of this material from Nova Copper's preliminary economic assessment for their Arctic deposit and from the background materials provided for the EIS scoping process for the Donlan gold mine. And that's all I have. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kendra Zamzow.
Thank you so much, Jill. And for those of you who have questions, just please hold your questions for the end. We're going to move along now to Dr. Zamzow. So I'd like to welcome and introduce Dr. Kendra Zamzow. Dr. Zamzow is an environmental biogeochemist and the Alaska representative for the Center for Science and Public Participation, also known as CSP2. She specializes in microbial interactions with trace metals, environmental toxicology, and processes relating to acid rock drainage, metal leaching, and water quality. Since joining the Center for Science and Public Participation, Dr. Zamzow has provided technical analysis of projects including copper heap leach closure, arsenic chemistry and a tailings impoundment, mercury release from thermal processing of gold, potential for acid drainage, and chemistry of underground coal gasification. She has commented on regulatory issues, including federal gold mine mercury air emission regulations and Alaska coal and water quality regulations. Recently, she completed an American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship at the EPA Office of Research and Development in Washington, D.C., and she currently lives in Chickaloon, Alaska. So building off of the mining proposal information that Jill shared with us, Dr. Zamzow is going to talk a little bit more about water chemistry and water quality and environmental health impacts. So thank you so much. Welcome, Kendra.
Hi, thank you, and thanks, Jill, for that introduction. I think it might be helpful for people to, after I've gone through my slides, to go back and look at Jill's again, because I think there's a lot of good detail information. I'm going to be talking about some of the chemical processes of where this starts. What is the source of acid and metals? How does this all come about? Then I'll give a few examples of streams that have been impacted and the conditions that led to that. And then I'd like to close by talking about long-term mine management. And I will also be using the Donlan mine. And we may be able to go through that fairly quickly since that's been covered very well by Jill. So if you go to slide 2, and I'm using a slide with animations. I'll let you know, for those of you that have the PDF, when I have animated slides going on. It might be a little confusing sometimes. On slide 2, I have 2 pictures. One is a very orange-red in the upper picture. This is acid rock drainage that has started in a tunnel. There's no mining occurring yet. This was early in the process of just exposing bedrock. And the lower one is a more yellowish. And these are both products of acid rock drainage. The upper one is something that can occur really without any mining whatsoever. If you just have a landslide that exposes a bluff with weathered rock or with bedrock underneath it, and it has the right kind of rock, this process can start. So, and this is where you have that red that you see is dissolved iron. And this is very classic because iron is the most abundant element on Earth. So you always see this red iron. When that acid hits a more natural stream, a natural pH stream, then it dilutes out and you get the iron precipitating, and that's the yellow that you see in the lower picture. So if you go to slide 3, this just introduces you to some of the language that I'll be talking about, and I don't think I'll go through much of it right now, just in the interest of time. I did want you to see the element symbols in case you're not familiar with that kind of shorthand, so you can go back when you see that on a slide and see what it refers to. I wanted to point out a major mistake that I made on this slide. The very last lower right, where I have FES, that's 1 iron and 1 sulfur, and that is iron sulfide. But when I refer to iron sulfide in this presentation, I'm usually referring to pyrite, which is 1 iron and 2 sulfur atoms. So don't beat me up over that one. There was a mistake there. Hopefully everybody's familiar with pH. We'll go over that very briefly on the next slide. Redox is a little bit complicated. An easy way to think about it is environments that have oxygen and environments that don't. That's not a full description, but it's a little bit close. And those really control whether your metals are in the water column or whether they're in the sediment. And I'm really only talking about water issues, and I'm only talking about hard rock. I'm not going to be talking about air and dust. And these are the two things that really control what's happening with metals. The other thing that controls them is sulfides and carbonates. And sulfides create acid and carbonates neutralize it. But your rocks have a big mix of everything. Oxides and silicates are more rock types that are in the mix, and they don't contribute really either way. And then we've already been introduced to PAG and NAG. So if you go to slide 4, again, there's this picture for those of you with the animations. All you see is a picture of the acid. Click again, and you'll see a picture of the pH scale. And this just reminds you of some common things, the pH of some common items. Click again, and you'll see a note that says wetlands that runs between pH 4 and 6. This is just to kind of remind people that acid is not always really toxic battery acid. It can be a natural acid. Wetlands commonly produce this, and that's one reason you often see kind of a reddish water moving through wetlands. If you click again, you see an arrow that says acid rock drainage. That's a pH of 0 to 3. You can actually get a negative pH, which is a little bit crazy, but it's just more aggressively acid. And it can be anywhere from around a vinegar type of acid to something that's much more like sulfuric acid. And then click again, and you'll see a box that says neutral drainage. Neutral drainage is it's where metals leach out of rock without any acid at all. And that does happen. So if we go to slide 5, unfortunately for you, those of you on the PDF, you won't be able to follow this. But what I'm trying to show is that when you have a mine, if you click, for those of you with the animations, go ahead and click, and you'll see where you start with a pit and some tunnels, or tunnels, depending on the geology. The first cut that you make is to look at a chunk of rock and decide if it has something worth going to a mill or something that's not worth going to a mill. And that can be a pretty fine distinction. It will depend on the concentration of the material that you want, and it can also depend on the price of the day. So for instance, things like some ore might be stockpiled because it's not economic to mill right now, but it might be at some point. And so mining companies are thinking about this all the time. But I wanted you to see that the first cut, you get this kind of waste rock material that goes into a pile. The second thing that happens is what has some ore that you want, copper or iron or lead or silver or whatever, goes into a mill. And again, all you're trying to do is scrape off what you don't want and get to what you do want so that you're only shipping out the good material. Click again, and you'll see the tailings pond come up. And tailings is your second waste stream. This is, once it's gone, what a mill does is it crushes your material to a very fine sandy, silty type texture, and then it applies some chemicals and some pH changes, again, to separate out what's good from what you don't want. So what ends up in the tailings pile, in some ways, can be very similar to your waste rock, but it's a much finer, siltier type of material, and it will also have some processed chemicals. Typically, tailings are sent out to a pond as a slurry. There are methods where you could kind of squeeze the water out of it and make more of a solid material. That tends to only be used with mines that have a small amount of tailings. It's a pretty energy-intensive process. So let's go to slide 6. And I wanted to talk about PAG and NAG a little bit in terms of the kinds of rock that generate them. And I mentioned this briefly a few slides ago. But your rock is a mixture of materials. And you might think of quartz or sandstone or something like that. But as an environmental chemist, you think about how much of that is sulfides, how much of that is calcium carbonate, how much is iron oxide, how much is clay. Clay is like an aluminum silicate. So that's what you're kind of looking at. And where there's sulfides, sulfides just means it's got that sulfur attached to the metal. So you can have a mercury sulfide, you can have an iron sulfide, you can have an antimony sulfide. There's lots of metals that love to attach to sulfide. So it's become one of the biggest problems in the mining industry because so many metals that you want also like to attach to these sulfides that then create essentially sulfuric acid. Carbonates, especially calcium carbonate, neutralize that material. So one way to think of that is in a lot of the soils we have up here can be very acidic, and if you lime it, you're neutralizing it, creating a different pH. So that's kind of what we're looking at here with the PAG and the NAG. If you go to slide 7, again, contaminant release, it doesn't depend on whether it's a copper mine or whether it's a silver mine. It really depends on the kind of rock that everything is hosted in. And iron, aluminum, and manganese are very commonly released if the material is a sulfide rock, just because they're very common elements. There's things we call trace elements: copper, zinc, cadmium, lead, and mercury. Those are also easily released by acid. So if we go to slide 8, this is the chemistry equations. I haven't produced the full equations, but I do have those on the very last slide if people are interested in that. What I wanted you to see from this was just to get a basic idea of what happens. In particular, we're looking at pyrite, which is iron with 2 sulfur atoms attached to it, and we call that an iron sulfide, but it's actually an iron disulfide. When it's exposed, when that fresh rock is exposed to oxygen and water, you release a form of dissolved iron, some sulfate, and some acid, and H+ represents acid. So it's essentially like a little bit of iron released in some sulfuric acid, and that's exactly what you see in those slides with the red coming out of the face of a rock. What happens next is that bacteria can get a hold of that iron and convert it to a different form, also of dissolved iron. And that's where things really get going. That other form of iron, that oxidized iron, then acts to accelerate the process. So you get the same kind of equation going on, but it's a different oxidizing reaction, and you get a lot more acid. So what I really want you to see from the slide is that in the upper equation, you get 2 hydrogen atoms. So you're getting a little bit of acid. In the lower equation, you're getting 16 hydrogen atoms, and it's a lot more acid. It's a much more aggressive reaction. And this really forms a spiral. It's an activity that you just can't stop once it really gets going. You have to have active intervention to stop this reaction. There's the classic mine where this is observed is an iron mine in California, where essentially this process is occurring and the entire mountain is dissolving. There just isn't any way to stop the roots of the process. They can treat the water, and they're doing that, and they will be doing that for 3,000 years. but you can't stop the root of the process. There are some technologies that are being developed to try to do that, but there isn't anything that's worked really well yet. So that's really the end of the chemistry equation, so you can breathe easy. Let's go to slide 9. There are some elements, this is the metal leaching part. Not all non-acid generating rock leaches metal, but some can. There are some things like selenium and arsenic that can be released under either acid conditions or under alkaline conditions. And they react differently in the environment. So let's go to slide 10. What I'm trying to show here is what happens when you release these different kinds of material, either these metals like copper and zinc, or these what we call metalloids or oxyanions, selenium and arsenic, also molybdenum, some other things. When the material is first released, it's acid and it has the metals in it. Those will stay in the water column until you start hitting a more neutral pH or oxidizing conditions or combination. So by oxidizing conditions, I mean, say, a bubbling stream has a lot of oxygen in it. When they hit those conditions, the iron that's dissolved begins to fall out, and it enters the sediment, and it actually armors the stream bed. And that's a big problem. It's not just staining the rocks with some iron, it's actually armoring the stream bed. At a little more neutral pH, pH 6 or so, the aluminum can start coming out and form these mucus-like streamers that get captured in fish gills and can actually suffocate fish. And different reactions continue as you go down the stream bed and to different pH conditions where more material starts to drop out and become part of the sediment. Let's go to for those of you with the PDF, you can see the iron dropping out, the iron armoring in the picture in the upper right. Let's go to slide 11. And for those of you with the PowerPoint, go ahead and press your key. You see the neutral acid drainage releasing alkaline metals, although again, these can also be released by acid. But under oxidizing conditions, they tend to stay actually dissolved, whereas your copper and zinc under oxidizing conditions tend to drop out and become part of the sediment. So it's the reverse of what's happening. The conditions that keep copper and zinc dissolved tend to keep selenium and arsenic precipitated in the sediment, and vice versa. Either way, you get metal cycling. You have metals moving from the water column to the sediment and back again. And once these materials are released into streams, you can't break them up into non-metals. You can break oil up into carbon and hydrogen, and you no longer have oil. But you can't break metals into non-metals. So once they're in the stream bed, that's called stream loading. They're in that environment. They're very hard to get out. You can really only dredge the material and put it somewhere else. So I'm not really going to talk about these examples just in the interest of time. I want to get through these. But if you go to slide 12, here's an example of acid drainage that's being dealt with right now in Oregon. Salmon and trout habitat that's been really devastated by acid and by copper and zinc loading in the stream. They're just coming up with a cleanup plan now, about 20 years after the mine closed. Let's go to the next slide. This is a selenium issue. This is not an acid issue, and what you're seeing on that slide is a waste rock pile. And this is another thing that's being dealt with right now, is they're trying to figure out what to do to slow the selenium that's been leaching into these streams. And both the water exceeds selenium standards, and the fish tissue is high enough to cause reproductive failure. If you go to slide 14, this is what I call mixed. This is the Mount Nansen mine, which is an area that I worked on looking at remediation options. This is a pretty modern mine, 1997 to 1999. And the problem here was they had sulfide tailings. They didn't have a lot of them. There was mixed with oxide tailings. So this is a little bit like the Arctic deposits that Jill was talking about. you've got this mix of tailings, and they had a water cover on it after closure, and they put a water treatment plant in to deal with some of the stuff that was coming out. It wasn't terribly bad water. The problem was the company said, our dam is going to freeze back. It's going to become a solid block of dirt, and you don't have to worry about it failing or anything happening there. Well, the problem was that that was wrong. It never froze back, and in fact, the bottom of the dam began to dissolve and kind of liquefy. So all of a sudden, the government was already kind of stuck with this water treatment plant that they were operating, and now suddenly they had a potential tailings failure that they couldn't allow to happen because there was so much sulfide in there, it would have created an immediate acid drainage problem. So they've been several years in the works, lots of negotiations, and they've finally come up with a cleanup plan. It'll probably cost around $20 million. And if I remember correctly, I think they decided with the plan that would take the tailings and put them in the old pit. So these things they're very complicated. And let's go to slide 15. This is Red Devil. This is an old underground mine. This is not a modern mine. They did just about everything wrong you could have thought to do wrong. It's an arsenic, antimony, and mercury issue, mostly arsenic and antimony. It's a mix of sulfides and carbonates, so it actually is not acidic right now, but I was just told a day or so ago by someone from DEC that there appears to be a spring that's acidic and has this classic coloration of acid drainage. So it'll be interesting to see if that proves true, if there's possibly a link from the surface to underground tunnels that may still have sulfides along the tunnel walls. And if the water is fluxing up and down in those tunnels and it reaches the surface, that could be a real problem. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And the BLM and EPA and DEC are all working on this mine site now. So this is really important. Go to the next slide. It says fish are not people. You can go ahead and click through if you have the PowerPoint. I'm looking at some of the things that do come out in acid and neutral drainage. Iron affects fish habitat. Aluminum, we talked about the suffocation. Copper makes fish, I call it drunk. It affects their sense of balance. It affects their sense of smell. It just really makes them disoriented. And that may be happening with frogs as well. There's some evidence of that. Selenium can cause deformities or reproductive failure. Antimony has no effect on fish. For those of you at the PowerPoint, just keep clicking through. Arsenic affects growth, and mercury affects the nervous system. When you look at people don't have problems with iron, aluminum, and copper. You actually need iron and copper. If you ingest enough of anything, of course, that's a bad thing, but when you're looking at water quality standards, if you're looking at drinking water, these are not issues. Selenium affects hair loss, but not, we don't get spinal deformities from it. So I'm just kind of showing that there's different effects on fish and on people. And we're affected at different concentrations. So for selenium, it affects fish at very low concentrations, 5 parts per billion or micrograms per liter. It takes a lot more to give us hair loss. Different effects, different concentrations. So if you look at arsenic, it's the other way around. It takes very little to start the process that could lead to lung or bladder cancer in people, and it takes a lot more to affect growth in fish. So when someone says something is contaminated, ask in what way and for what. Is it aquatic life issue or is it a people issue? The standards I'm showing here are for fish or for freshwater aquatic life standards from the Alaska DEC, and for people it's drinking water. The next slide is a mock-up of Donlan's mine. In the waste rock, they expect to have arsenic, antimony, selenium, and sulfate. It'll be, again, a mixture of non-acid generating and potentially acid generating rock, as Jill said. And the tailings will be very similar, although they'll also have mercury and cyanide and maybe some manganese. So what do you do with this? How do you manage this stuff? Let's go to the next slide, 18. You put it in a pit lake if you can, or put it in a pit at the end of mining. that's what they're planning to do. So you would drain the tailings pond, take all that water, put it in the pit, put some of the waste rock in the pit, cover up the old tailings area, put a cover on it so you're not getting water, you're not getting oxygen, or at least you're limiting the water, and put a cover over the, for those of you that have a PDF, you may not have seen the tailings pile. I apologize for that. You need to put a cover over the waste rock to limit the water getting to it, because it's really more of a leaching problem than an acid problem. So you don't want oxygen in there because there will be some PAG, but mostly you want to limit the water that goes in there. And you're going to have to root this water. This raw water will be there throughout forever. This is this is now part of the landscape, and so you've got to root that runoff into the pit lake, and then they'll be treating that water in perpetuity. So very quickly, slide 19. You're really, when you set up a modern mine, you're looking at it from a waste management perspective from the very beginning. How do we control? What are the elements that are going to be an issue, and how do we control that? How do we set up the landscape so we control that from the very beginning? For PEG rock, you're really looking at either putting a water cover over it or a chemical neutralization with lime. And that's an active process of liming water. It really doesn't work very well to just throw lime on top of a waste rock pile. And in both PEG and neg rock, you really want to look at covering that. Again, with the PEG, you want to do it underwater so you're preventing oxygen from getting to it. But you also want to try to limit the water getting to the solid material. I didn't say that right. I'm sorry. For the neg rock, you want to cover over it. If you don't have a water cover on PEG, then you also need a cover on that, but you can also put it under a water cover. I have some examples of control systems in the next two slides. Red Dog is covering their waste rock to limit water getting through it to prevent sulfate from getting out. They're having a sulfate issue. They also have a waste rock pile that has an acid issue, and that will require treatment in perpetuity. So they are planning for that right now. At Donlan, as we've heard, they'll be commingling their acid and non-acid rock, and then they'll also be chemically treating this water from the pit lake. And I wanted to note that from what I've seen, I do not see a good method for removing selenium at Donlan. And I mentioned that in my public scoping comments, so we'll see what happens there. Slide 21, this is just about the last slide. Nothing comes cheap. Red Dog, that water treatment is likely to cost around $10 million a year. They are bonded for $300 million. That is very much increased from where it was in 2005 before they knew they had an acid rock problem. Equity Silver I put in there because this is kind of has been held up as, yes, we can do perpetual water treatment. Equity Silver closed in 1994, and they have been doing perpetual water treatment for 20 years. I was not able to find out what that costs, but I was able to find documents that said the government has a $50 million bond, and I presume that's what they're using to operate this. On the bottom in small print, I have some old mines that either are or are going to cost about $1 million a year to operate water treatment plants. The one in Silverton has not been built yet. EPA wants to build one. The responsible party wants a cash settlement, so that's kind of being discussed where that's going to go, whether a treatment plant goes in or not. So on slide 22, I have a summary. It doesn't matter if you're mining copper or silver or lead. It's really about the rock that it's in that causes this either acid or alkaline material to come out and metals to come out with it. And then mines do cost, all of this costs a lot of money to treat. You do want to plan ahead because it costs less if you plan ahead. But the caveat here is that the mining companies have done a really good job over the last 10 or 15 years of learning more and planning more. But because it takes decades for some of this material to see if your predictions were right, to see how things work, this is going to be an ongoing process for a long time to see what really works and how to plan ahead for these. And that was all I had. And my contacts are on slide 23. And I turn it over to Diana for questions.
Thank you so much, Kendra. And I agree with her suggestion that everyone might want to revisit Jill's slides in light of the presentation and further information on acid rock drainage to see more about those specific proposals. Now is the time, the portion of the call when we invite your participation and questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation and be brief so others have the opportunity to participate. And then it's real important that you press *2 again when you're done with your question so that we don't get a lot of background noise. So the call is now open for questions of either of our speakers.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, this is Jack DeMarchi